I found out someone was planning to take part of my land from a guy watering his roses. Not a lawyer, not a city official, not even the people behind it. Just my neighbor, Hank, leaning over his fence one warm Thursday evening with that look people get when they know something you don't. He squinted toward the back of my property and said, "So, you finally sold that strip behind the field?" I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. "Sold what strip?" I asked. He shrugged. "The one they're putting the walking trail through." For a second, I just stared at him. Then he stared back. Neither of us laughed after that. The next morning, I walked out back with a cup of coffee and saw exactly what he was talking about. Bright orange survey flags. Dozens of them. They stretched across the rear edge of my property in a perfectly straight line, like somebody had taken a ruler to my land and decided where my ownership ended and their plans began. I stood there longer than I care to admit. The coffee got cold in my hand while I just looked at those flags fluttering in the breeze. Now, I live outside a little town called Red Creek. Nothing fancy. I got a little over 4 acres. Bought the place nearly 16 years ago when nobody wanted land out there. My house sits near the road, and behind it there's a long open field that slopes gently toward tree line. I never built anything on that section. Never felt the need to. Sometimes I'd walk back there with my dog, Duke. Sometimes I'd sit in an old folding chair and watch the sun go down. Most days I left it alone. Apparently, leaving something alone is enough for certain people to assume it belongs to them. Behind my property, there used to be open pasture. Then a few years ago, a development showed up almost overnight. 60-something homes, matching mailboxes, matching fences, matching landscaping. The kind of neighborhood where every trash can disappear at exactly the same time every Tuesday morning. They called it Cedar Ridge. Of course, they had an HOA. That afternoon, I did some digging online and found exactly what I was afraid of. Right there on the community website was a beautiful digital rendering showing families strolling along a landscape trail lined with benches and decorative lights. The description called it a nature connection corridor designed to encourage community wellness and outdoor recreation. It looked wonderful. There was just one problem. Part of it was drawn directly through my land. I drove over to the HOA office that same day. The place looked like every HOA office you've ever imagined. Clean brick building, fresh flowers, soft music playing through hidden speakers. The receptionist smiled before I even reached the desk. "How can I help you?" "My name's Ethan Parker," I said. "I live behind Phase 2. I'm here about the survey markers on my property." Something changed in her face. Not much. Just enough. "Oh yes," she said. "The corridor project." "The corridor project?" I repeated. She folded her hands neatly on the desk. "It's going to be a wonderful improvement for the area. Walking paths, benches, native plants." "Who approved construction on my property?" Her smile tightened. "Well, the plans were filed with the county months ago." I remember staring at her for a second. Filed. Not approved by me. Filed. Not purchased. Filed. As if paperwork somehow transformed somebody else's land into community property. Then she said the sentence that stuck in my head for weeks. "You don't really use that section anyway." I don't know why that bothered me as much as it did. Maybe it was her tone. Maybe it was the assumption. Maybe it was because my father spent half his life regretting what happened when he let people decide what counted as important on his property. Whatever the reason, something settled deep in my chest right then. I nodded, thanked her for her time, walked back to my truck, and the entire drive home, I couldn't stop hearing that sentence. You don't really use it anyway. That night, I dug out the original survey from when I bought the property. I spread it across my kitchen table and studied every line under the yellow glow of the overhead light. The boundaries hadn't changed. No easements, no public access, no shared right-of-way, nothing, just my land. And somewhere around midnight, sitting alone at that table, I realized this wasn't really about 12 feet of dirt. It was about what happens when people convince themselves that quiet ownership is the same thing as abandonment. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to start with lawyers. I wasn't going to start with threats. I was going to do something far more inconvenient. I was going to make sure every person in Cedar Ridge understood that land doesn't have to be developed to be valuable. And before the first seed ever touched the ground, before the first argument happened, before the HOA president ever knocked on my door, I had already started planning a response they never saw coming. The following Saturday, I rented a tractor. Nothing dramatic. No giant machine rolling in like a scene from a movie. Just a compact utility tractor with a tiller attachment and a trailer full of irrigation supplies. The guy at the rental yard looked at the order sheet and laughed. Starting a farm, Ethan? Something like that. He nodded and handed me the keys. By 8 that morning, I was working the backstrip. The soil hadn't been touched in years. Thick grass, wild growth, roots running every direction. The first pass rattled the entire machine. Dirt rolled over in dark waves behind me, while birds scattered from the field. And I have to admit, it felt good. Not angry, not spiteful, just purposeful. Like every pass was a reminder that ownership isn't something you announce. It's something you exercise. Around lunchtime, I noticed a few people standing behind the Cedar Ridge fence line, watching. One woman pointed. A man folded his arms. Another pulled out his phone. Good. Let them watch. By Sunday evening, that entire 12-foot strip looked completely different. Freshly turned soil. Irrigation tubing laid out in neat rows. Stakes marking future planting sections. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked active. Monday morning, I started planting. Corn first, then pole beans, then squash. Nothing decorative. Nothing pretty. Nothing that belonged in a developer's brochure. I wanted crops that grew tall, spread wide, and made one thing very clear. This land had a purpose. By Wednesday, I added signs. Private agricultural property. No trespassing. Active cultivation area. And near the entrance gate, I added one more. Organic pest management in use. Technically true. I hadn't applied anything yet, but I plan to if needed. Funny thing about suburban neighborhoods. The phrase pesticide tends to make people suddenly respect property lines. The phone call came the next morning. Unknown number. I answered while sitting on my porch. Mr. Parker? Speaking. This is Daniel Whitmore, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. There it was. Finally. We need to discuss what you're doing behind the neighborhood. I leaned back in my chair. I'm using my property. Silence. Then a slow exhale. You appear to be interfering with a planned community improvement. Your planned improvement crosses my land. The plans were submitted months ago. I bought that land 16 years ago. Long pause. Then he said, perhaps we should meet. We agreed on that afternoon. Daniel showed up exactly on time. Of course he did. The man looked like he had been assembled in a corporate laboratory. Crisp polo shirt. Perfect haircut. Expensive sunglasses. Clipboard tucked under one arm. He walked toward the field and stopped dead when he saw the rows. What exactly is all this? He asked. Crops. His jaw flexed. Is this temporary? I laughed. Actually laughed. The look on his face made it impossible not to. You think I rented equipment, installed irrigation, and planted hundreds of dollars worth of seed for a temporary demonstration? His smile disappeared. We're attempting to create something beneficial for the broader community. On my property, it would increase home values. I pointed toward the rows. So will fresh vegetables. That earned me a look. Not anger exactly. More like irritation that the script wasn't working. People like Daniel spend most of their lives talking to people who want approval. I didn't. He tried another approach. The corridor would only require a small section. Whose section? Well, Mine. The conversation stalled there. He knew it. I knew it. Finally, he glanced at the signs. The county has reviewed our proposal, and my survey still says this belongs to me. His pen scratched across his clipboard. We'll be speaking with county officials. I nodded. Please do. When he left, he didn't look happy. When I watched him drive away, neither was I. Because the truth is, this whole thing had started getting under my skin. Not because of the land. Because of the assumption. The confidence. The idea that if enough paperwork existed, eventually ownership would simply become an inconvenience. 2 weeks passed. The corn sprouted. Then grew. The beans climbed. The squash spread. Every morning the strip looked a little more alive. Every morning it looked a little harder to pave over. Then county officials showed up. 2 of them. An older inspector named Carl and a younger zoning officer named Rebecca. They spent nearly 2 hours walking the property. Questions about irrigation. Questions about zoning. Questions about water usage. Questions about agricultural activity. I answered everything. Showed permits. Showed surveys. Showed receipts. At one point, Carl looked around the field and scratched his chin. You planning to sell produce? Maybe. You got every right to. Rebecca studied the survey one more time, then looked at me. Mr. Parker, You're operating entirely within county regulations. I nodded. She nodded. That was pretty much the end of it. A week later, I learned Cedar Ridge had received exactly the answer they didn't want. No violación. No enforcement acción. No legal basis. Game over. At least that's what I thought. I underestimated something. The residents. Because once the legal argument started dying, the emotional argument took over. People began showing up near the fence almost every evening. Some were curious. Some were annoyed. Some acted like I'd personally stolen something from them. One afternoon, a little boy squeezed through a gap near the tree line and started walking toward the corn. I waved him back. Hey, buddy, private property. His mother hurried over. I'm so sorry, she said. No problem. The kid looked disappointed. I just wanted to see the plants. I smiled. I get it. The mother hesitated. Then she said something that stuck with me. It's just, we were told there would be open green space back here. I looked across the rows. There still is. She frowned. Not like before. And that's when I finally understood what was really happening. The residents hadn't stolen anything. Most of them honestly believed they'd been promised something. A developer sold a vision. An HOA embraced it. And somewhere along the line, everybody stopped asking who actually owned the land in the picture. That realization softened me a little. Not toward Daniel. Not toward the board. But toward the families. The people who bought homes based on brochures and promises. One evening, my neighbor Frank came over carrying 2 cold beers. We stood by the fence watching the wind move through the corn. They're talking about you constantly, he said. I'm sure they are. No, I mean constantly. I laughed. Well, at least I'm contributing to the community. Frank nearly spit out his drink. Then he got serious. You know why they're upset? Because they didn't get their trail. He shook his head. No. I looked at him. They're upset because they thought nobody would ever say no. That one sat with me. Because deep down, I knew he was right. The crops kept growing. The complaints kept circulating. The HOA kept searching for leverage. And then, one evening near the end of July, just as the sun turned everything gold and the corn stood taller than my shoulders, Daniel Whitmore showed up again. Except this time, he wasn't carrying a clipboard. And somehow that worried me more. Daniel stood at the fence for a moment before speaking. No clipboard. No polished presentation. No carefully rehearsed HOA language. Just a man who looked tired. That caught me off guard. For weeks he'd shown up acting like he was presenting quarterly earnings to a board of directors. Now he looked like somebody who hadn't slept much. We need to talk, he said. I set down the irrigation hose and walked over. Seems like we've done plenty of that. A few other residents were with him this time. A woman named Laura who jogged past every evening. An older retired guy named Gene. A couple others I recognized, but didn't really know. Nobody looked particularly happy. Laura spoke first. When we bought our house, they showed us drawings of trail. I believe you. They said there would always be open access behind the neighborhood. I nodded. I believe that too. Daniel shifted his weight. My dad spent years regretting a decision he made because people convinced him a small piece of land wasn't worth fighting for. I looked down at the dirt beneath my boots. He kept telling himself it wasn't a big deal. Then I looked back up. Until one day, it was permanent. Daniel stared at me. Laura too. Even Jean seemed to be listening differently now. I wasn't protecting 12 feet, I said. I was protecting the idea that somebody should ask first. For the first time in months, nobody argued. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody challenged me. Because deep down, I think they understood. Maybe not completely, but enough. Construction started 3 weeks later. I watched equipment move through Cedar Ridge instead of across my property. The new trail stayed entirely on their side of the line. The benches went in. The decorative lights went in. Families started walking there every evening. Life moved on. And one morning I noticed something strange. The survey flags were gone. Every single one. No apology. No explanation. No letter. No acknowledgement. Just gone. Like they had never existed. I stood in the field with a cup of coffee, looking at the rows of corn swaying in the breeze. The same field. The same property. But somehow it felt different. Maybe because I'd finally stopped wondering whether I'd done enough. The answer was standing right in front of me. That fall the harvest came in better than I expected. More corn than I could eat. More beans than I knew what to do with. Enough squash to feed an army. So I set up a folding table near the road. Fresh corn. Pay what you want. Nothing fancy. Just a cardboard sign and a coffee can for money. The first customer surprised me. several Cedar Ridge residents. Laura showed up with her kids. Jean came by. A young couple bought 3 bags of vegetables and spent 20 minutes talking about gardening. Slowly, the tension faded. Not completely, but enough. One afternoon, Laura picked up a few ears of corn and smiled. You know, this is actually really good. I laughed. That's usually the goal. She hesitated. Then she said something that stuck with me. I don't think we ever looked at it from your side. I nodded. Most people don't. She smiled awkwardly. Fair enough. Even Daniel changed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But one evening I saw him walking the completed trail. Hands behind his back, looking toward the field. For a second our eyes met. He gave a small nod. I nodded back. That was it. No grand apology. No movie ending. Just 2 stubborn men acknowledging reality. And honestly, that felt more genuine. Now here's the part some people won't agree with. The following spring, I didn't plant the strip again. At least not the way I had before. Instead, I scattered native wildflower seeds. Dozens of varieties. Nothing organized. Nothing manicured. Just nature doing what nature does. By summer, the entire strip exploded with color. Tall flowers. Butterflies. Bees. Native grasses swaying in the wind. Sometimes people walking the Cedar Ridge Trail stop and look. Sometimes they wave. Sometimes they don't. Either way is fine, because the point was never to build a wall between us. The point was to establish where the line actually belonged. I've had people tell me I should have sued. Others say I overreacted. A few still think I was stubborn. Maybe they're right. Maybe I was. But here's what I know. If I'd ignored those survey flags, even for a little while, eventually somebody would have said the trail was already there. Eventually somebody would have argued it was too late. Eventually temporary would have become permanent. And that's how things disappear. Not all at once. Little by little. One assumption at a time. So now I'm curious what you think. If you walked out one morning and found survey markers crossing your property, what would you have done? Would you have hired a lawyer immediately? Would you have sat down with the HOA and tried to negotiate? Would you have ignored it and hoped it worked itself out? Or would you have done exactly what I did and planted something they couldn't ignore? Let me know in the comments. Because this story was never really about land. It was about boundaries. And sometimes the hardest thing in the world isn't building a fence. It's deciding where you're willing to draw the line.